Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation today with Dr. Fred Lessing and his experience hiding out as a refugee during World War II from the Nazi occupation in his native Netherlands. So Fred, we were talking about you and your brothers and your dad hiding out in a small cottage and what that meant, because it was a hard scrabble existence, and by then the Germans had cut off a lot of food supplies, and so the Netherlands was in a real hardship, and it was winter time.
Absolutely. It was called as the Hongerwinter van 1944-45. As I said, I could write a book about that year because the bonds between my brothers and my father, it was amazing. We just worked together. And we maintained the probably almost crazy hope that my mother would survive. And then when she did, it was just amazing. One other thing, so there's this survival of the four of us. And then the other thing that dominated that year was the coming liberation. The war front came, finally they crossed the Rhine, and it was coming closer and closer and closer. And there came we started building a shelter in the ground, halfway into the ground and up above, because we knew it was going to come one of these days, and that day came. Started early in the morning with more airplanes and more gunfire in the distance. It got louder and louder, and could hear tanks, and we all went into the shelter, except my father stayed in the cottage. He said, I got to bring some food. It got more and more close. You could actually occasionally hear tanks and stuff, and it was like Armageddon out there. And my brother Ed said to me, run back to the, at 9 years, almost 9 years old, I was a good runner. And there was a little bit of a distance to the cottage. I ran what feels like, I ran through hell, out there. I ran as fast as I could, and I opened the door. Here's my father in his apron, and he's cooking chicken on our little stove. And I said, Pop, you got to come. It's terrible. You got to come inside. It's too dangerous. He said, well, we don't know how long we're going to be in there. We're going to need some food. I said, I'll be along, very sure. I said, what are you cooking? He said, chicken. He said, the farmer came by, bomb had fallen on his chicken house. And so he's just giving all unheard of luxury.
Well, meat at that time was so scarce.
We hadn't seen chicken in ever, I think.
Although farmers were the one group of people who did have food.
Yes, farmers make food. So I ran back to the cottage, and a little bit later he came with his fried chicken and some fried corn, and we went into the shelter and spent there, I think, 3 nights and 2 days, something like that.
Meanwhile, all this bombing is going on around you.
Yes, it got really loud through the night. And then the second night or the third night, I can't remember exactly, but during the night it suddenly got quiet, eerily quiet. And we waited till daylight, then we came out. We'd been liberated. And we couldn't tell that right away. And then we saw in the distance, it was a weird sight. Along the horizon, you saw heads moving along. Like some crazy video. What it was the tanks, the Allied tanks. The Canadian Army liberated us. And they just sank into the ground as each tank had got deeper. So all we saw were the heads of the guys on top. And then after a while, we went into the village. And there's some crazy stories. I'll skip over them. There's one that my father said, well, if we're liberated, I'm going to the soup kitchen. There was a soup kitchen where you could get watery soup. He had a bucket on his bicycle with wooden tires and rode into the village. And as he came to the entrance to the village, there were these 2 German machine gunners, one on each side of the road in a hole, yelling at him. I think the only reason they didn't kill him is because they were waiting to fight the army. The Canadian Army had called it rest for a couple nights. So he'd come right through the front on his bicycle, and they started yelling at him, and he realized, turned around, and came riding back. and stuff like that.
Not safe for soup
but
yet.
that was one of the great highlights of my life. I don't
So
think
can you even describe the feeling of liberation, what that means? I mean, what it looks like, what it feels like?
we lived between a railroad and a highway, maybe a couple miles apart, and they would attack both cars on the highway and ammunition train. There was one time when they were dive bombing the whole day on this 100-car ammunition train, German ammunition. And it's like incredible fireworks, and it was all spectacular. And this is about when, I call this lightnings. American Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, amazing, very distinctive twin-boomed and double-tailed fighter planes that came roaring over our cottage at treetop height in broad daylight one morning in the very early spring of '45 and left Ott and me breathless with excitement. It was our very first sighting of the good guys, our Allied liberators. And we did see them, not only their airplane, because when Ott and I, alerted by the unfamiliar and thunderous roar, had stormed out of the cottage to investigate, we could clearly see, and it seemed, make eye contact with the pilots, who, it seemed, waved back at us. Like the boys we still were, we were excited about seeing these most unusual airplanes, and like the seasoned, grown-up survivors we had become, we were ecstatic at this glorious and absolutely visual proof that the war would come to an end, that it could come to an end, that it was possible and happening. It was a moment of emotional fireworks, a moment of awe and joy, free, really free. These guys would liberate us, and soon. Thrilled, we ran back into the cottage to tell my father. He was busily cooking again. "Pop," we screamed at him, "you've got to see it. It has 2 tails." But our father, who had absolutely no interest in things mechanical, replied, "I don't care if he has 7 tails." Ott and I were crushed. To us, they were like angels. Messengers from a better world. If it is possible to love combat airplanes, then I have always loved these Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, heralds of hope for an 8-year-old hidden child. So that's kind of an answer to you.
Absolutely.
Every sentence about the future started with, when the war ends, or when it's over, we were all waiting for it.
And so life could begin then.
And one more from this same period. With the nighttime fiery crash of a twin-engine British de Havilland Mosquito, not far from us, I lost a lot of my boyish romance with airplanes. It came screaming out of the night, very low, over the trees and on fire, and disappeared in the darkness just before the sound and firelight of its crashing. The next morning, the 4 of us went to look. It was very shocking. An enormous encounter with the obscene reality of military warfare. Both the plane and its 2 pilots had disintegrated and were scattered in many parts and many places. Both Ott and I remember finding or seeing a bloody finger with a ring on it, and Ed recalls shreds of flesh hanging on a barbed wire fence. We brought home many pieces of airplane, including balsa wood. The Mosquito was made of wood, and little ball bearings, both of which were a source of marvel to me, but both of which was always evoked the memory of that scene of carnage where 2 more good guys died in the battle to free us. So it was both exciting and frightening. The war, you know.
And a kind of reality, serious, grim reality that the average child should not have to experience. And yet you were there, and you had to live through that. I was really touched in the previous passage that you read, when you talked about these liberators being angels, because the translation of your mother's name is angel.
Yeah,
And
Angeline.
and after the liberation, then you're left to wonder, where is our mom? Can you finish with that?
Yes. Let's see. That was, of course, our question: would my mother still be alive? And the liberation was so overwhelmingly joyful; it was amazing. And my father went and asked the Canadians, how could he find out? And they said, "Well, we're sending a courier to Berlin, to the Red Cross. They're making lists, and he should be back in I think they said 2 weeks." So my father came back 2 weeks later, and there's a man sitting at a wooden table outside with all these lists. And this man had just found out that his whole family was not on the list. This was a list of survivors. And he was looking through it, and he said, "Yes, your wife is on this list." And he said, "See, Angeline van Leer," because she went by her maiden name. And he said, Where is she?" He said, "Well, let's see, she's in Algiers, North Africa." My father said, "No, that can't be right. We don't know anybody in South Africa." The whole world had been turned upside down. And he said, "These lists are really accurate. They've taken every possible care, and there are no mistakes. Your wife is alive. Go home and tell your kids." So my father, who had stopped at the soup kitchen, had a bucket of soup hanging on his handlebars, and it was about maybe a mile and a half or so to the village. And we were playing outside, and because we were liberated, you know. We could hear him yelling and screaming, and we were looking. He's coming on his bicycle at full speed, and the milk from he had a bucket of milk. It was splashing all over the place. "Mother is alive! Mother is alive!" It was so amazing, and we all just cried our heads off. You know, it was like a miracle, and that's the only joy that was even greater than the liberation. Actually, when she finally came home in Rosh Hashanah, somewhere in September, October, she finally came back, and that was an amazing night.
Were you still at the cottage?
No, we had gone back to Delft, where they had given, you know, this Nazis had stolen all the Jewish stuff, and then after they disappeared, they got all this stuff back and put it in a warehouse, and they told my father and Ed, who went to see it, "Take whatever you want." And so we got a whole house with furniture and everything that goes into a house. After that, or even before that, within a month of being back in Delft, I was back in school. And the amazing thing about that was, 4th grade, not a word was said. It was, "Welcome to the 4th grade. Reading, arithmetic, geography, French." Not a word, not even about the war.
So people are sweeping this under the rug, but yet you're going to school with kids whose parents were probably collaborators?
Yes, very possibly, yes. And as I wrote at one point, it's just incredible. Here we are at that point when I wrote this, was 50 years later, and we're still wondering what the hell happened.
Your dad and Ed moved to the United States.
My parents did not, and my mother and father both, did not want to stay in Holland any longer.
Because it was no longer home. It was a place that had betrayed them?
Yeah, unbelievably so, because Jews had lived in perfect harmony in Holland for hundreds of years. Yeah. It wasn't only that there weren't hiding places in Holland, there's a lot of anti-Semitism that surfaced. A lot of, not like, you know, later I learned about Belgium, who we were always looking down on. You know, Belgium is lower or something than Holland. Survival figures are much better in Belgium and France than they are in Holland. And I think it's not all due to the lack of mountains. they had, almost from the beginning, applied, you had to apply for a visa and all of that. Ed and my father went in 1947 to America, and they both found work. And then they said we could come, and my mother and Ad and I got on a boat in Rotterdam, and 10 days to get to New York. So then started this whole new way of life, and Holland was way across the ocean and long forgotten, and nobody talked about it. Not amnesia. Anybody asked me, I could have told everything I've said here, but nobody asked, and nobody talked, and we didn't talk, nobody talked.
And this really...
For 40 years. It is incredible, and it's one of the reasons I became a psychologist. I wanted to understand how this could have happened. When you're faced with a life-threatening event, and it doesn't have to be the Holocaust, it can be any such thing, it creates a situation in which your feelings are automatically repressed. It's a survival, it's like fight or flight, and it goes in so deeply, because in order to act, you must not feel.
So you are a firm believer in Holocaust education, and so since your retirement, so you had a career in teaching, then a second career in psychology and counseling, but you continue to go out and speak to groups about this. Why is this education so important?
The reason I continue, or what my belief in Holocaust education is that, I had a colleague who wrote a book about the Holocaust, and he argues that there are no lessons to be learned in the Holocaust because it is such a totally irrational thing. There's nothing you can deduce from it. And I disagreed with him. I said there's at least one lesson you can learn that's really obvious. He said, what? I said, well, it's totally obvious to me that all people are capable of what happened. It's not a bunch of maniacs. And it's easier to argue that these days because you can see it all around you. Nice American boys go and fight for ISIS. Or My Lai, those are nice American boys who wrote lovely Christmas letters to their parents, massacring women and children. So I say, under the right circumstances, or rather under the wrong circumstances, we are all capable of that kind of behavior. And I said, and the most difficult is to believe that about yourself. Mm. Nobody, and not me, or not my parents, but it's not true. So that's the lesson that I think there is. And these days it feels as though I don't really need to hammer on that because it's so obvious in subsequent history.
So if we have to finish it up and you're,
yes.
you're in front of a group of students at a school, what's your one piece of advice that you would like to send them out with?
I had this seventh grade guy. He was a journalist for the little school paper, and he's the one that kept bugging me about what did you feel, what did you feel? And finally answered him and said, I'll give you an honest answer. I said, here's what I felt. There are two different answers, and they're both true. One is nothing. That's PTSD. The other answer is, I now know that I was totally terrorized the whole time. So after the applause of my speech, he stands up again in the back of the room and he says, so did anything good come out of all this for you? It was such a funny question. Or I couldn't help ask that, well, duh, I survived. Doesn't get any better than that. Then I felt a little ashamed of that. And I said, no, let me give you a better answer. I said, the Holocaust leaves a lot of bad stuff inside survivors, and me too. I said, I don't talk a lot about that, but it certainly is there. But there's also the other side. The other side is that I don't take anything for granted anymore. Every little good thing is, wow, life is so amazingly good and there's so much of it. I said, after I speak to you guys, I go to the car parking lot and I've regressed because of my speaking, and I say, oh, there's my car. I have a car. I own a car. And I have a house, and I have a wife, and I have children, and I have music, and I have camping in the summer, and I go on, and books, and it goes on and on and on. And there is just so much beautiful stuff that human beings are also capable of, that is something good that comes out of surviving a life-threatening event. And I think that's true for people who survive cancer, or car accidents, or strokes, or any life-threatening event, that your life is changed by it. You never quite get rid of the fears and the anxieties, but you also have an inordinate joy and appreciation of how good life can be and how beautiful life is, how mysterious and how amazing love is. You know, there's so much that's good. So that was my end. That's what I end with.
Mm-hmm. Well, this conversation has been a real gift for me, I know, and I'm sure for our viewers too. I want to thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming and sharing your story.